The November rain was falling hard on the Death Wish set in Lower Manhattan, turning the already gritty streets into a maze of puddles and shadows. It was the kind of miserable night that made everyone want to wrap up filming and head home to somewhere warm and dry. But for Charles Bronson, this cold Tuesday evening would become one of the most important nights of his life. Not because of anything that happened in front of the cameras, but because of what he overheard in a quiet moment between takes. The production had been filming in New York for 6 weeks by November 1974, and the cast and crew had settled into the rhythm that develops during any long shoot. Charles had earned a reputation among the crew as a professional, who kept to himself but treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position on the production hierarchy. Unlike some stars who only acknowledged other actors and directors, Charles made a point of learning the names of the grips, electricians and other behind-the-scenes workers who made the movie possible. One of those workers was Eddie Martinez, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who worked as a grip on the electrical crew. Eddie had been with the production since the beginning, and Charles had noticed him because of his quiet competence and the gentle way he dealt with the younger, less experienced crew members. Eddie never complained about the long hours or difficult conditions, and he had a kind of dignity that Charles recognized and respected. On this particular night, the crew was setting up for a complex scene in an abandoned building, and there was a longer than usual break while the lighting technicians adjusted their equipment. Charles was sitting in his chair reviewing his lines for the next scene when he overheard Eddie talking quietly on a payphone in the corner of the location. What Charles heard made him stop reading and listen more carefully. Eddie was speaking in Spanish, but Charles had picked up enough of the language during his years in Hollywood to understand the basics. Eddie was talking to someone about a hospital, about money they didn't have, and about a little girl who was getting sicker. When Eddie finished his call and walked back toward the set, Charles could see that the man was trying not to cry. The conversation had clearly been devastating, and Eddie was struggling to compose himself before returning to work. Charles watched as Eddie took several deep breaths, wiped his eyes, and forced his face into the neutral expression that working men learn to wear when they can't afford to show weakness. Charles made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of returning to his script, he walked over to where Eddie was checking electrical cables and asked if they could talk privately for a moment. "Is everything okay, Eddie?" Charles asked in his characteristic quiet tone. "You seem upset." Eddie looked surprised that anyone had noticed, and even more surprised that Charles Bronson was asking about his personal life. "It's nothing, Mr. Bronson, just family stuff. I'll be fine." But Charles had spent enough years reading people to know when someone was carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. "Sometimes it helps to talk about it," he said simply. "I've got some time if you need to get it off your chest." What followed was a conversation that Eddie Martinez would remember for the rest of his life, slowly, carefully, as if he was afraid that speaking the words would make everything worse. Eddie told Charles about his 7-year-old daughter Maria, who had been diagnosed with leukemia 3 months earlier. The medical bills were destroying the family financially. Eddie's wife had quit her job to stay home and care for Maria, leaving Eddie as the only income source. The insurance coverage was inadequate, and the experimental treatment that Maria's doctors recommended would cost more than Eddie made in 2 years. The phone call Charles had overheard was from the hospital billing department, informing Eddie that Maria's treatment would be suspended if the family couldn't make a substantial payment by the end of the week. "She's such a good kid," Eddie said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay composed. "She never complains, even when the chemo makes her sick. She keeps asking when she can come visit Daddy at work and meet the movie star. I don't know what to tell her anymore." Charles listened to the entire story without interrupting, his face showing none of the emotion that was building inside him. When Eddie finished talking, Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had heard and deciding what he was going to do about it. "What's the name of the hospital?" Charles asked finally. Eddie looked confused. "St. Mary's Children's Hospital in Queens." "But Mr. Bronson, I wasn't asking for—" "I know you weren't," Charles cut him off gently. "That's what makes this different. Give me Maria's full name and your wife's name. I'm going to make some phone calls." What happened next revealed a side of Charles Bronson that few people ever saw. Within hours of his conversation with Eddie, Charles had contacted St. Mary's Children's Hospital and arranged to speak directly with Maria's primary physician. He learned about her condition, her treatment options, and the financial realities that were limiting her care. The next morning, before filming resumed, Charles made a visit to the hospital that he kept completely private. He told no one from the production where he was going, and he made sure that his visit wouldn't be documented or publicized in any way. When he arrived at the pediatric oncology ward, he asked to speak with the billing department about Maria Martinez's account. According to hospital administrator Margaret Chen, who handled the meeting, Charles's request was simple and direct. He wanted to pay all of Maria's existing medical bills and establish an account that would cover any future treatment she might need. When Chen explained that the total cost could easily exceed $200,000, Charles didn't hesitate. "Then that's what we'll do," he said, pulling out his checkbook. "And I want to make sure her family doesn't know where this money is coming from. As far as they're concerned, it's some kind of hospital assistance program." But Charles didn't stop there. He also asked to meet Maria, if her parents were comfortable with it. When Eddie and his wife Carmen brought their daughter to the hospital the next day for her treatment, they were amazed to find Charles Bronson waiting in the children's playroom. Maria was a tiny girl, made even smaller by her illness, but she had bright, curious eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face when she realized who was visiting her. Charles spent over an hour with her, talking about movies, asking about her favorite toys, and listening to her stories about school and her friends. He was so gentle with her, Carmen Martinez later told her sister. "You'd never think this tough movie star would know how to talk to a sick little girl, but he made her laugh like she hadn't laughed in months." She forgot all about being in the hospital. Charles established a routine that he maintained for the remainder of the Death Wish production and beyond. Every few days, between filming or during breaks in his schedule, he would quietly visit Maria at the hospital. He never made a big production of these visits, and he always coordinated with the medical staff to make sure he wasn't interfering with her treatment. The visits meant everything to Maria, who was going through the frightening and painful process of cancer treatment. Charles brought her books, small toys, and most importantly, his complete attention during every visit. He would sit beside her bed and listen to whatever she wanted to talk about, treating her conversations with the same seriousness he gave to discussions with directors and producers. Dr. Sarah Williams, Maria's oncologist, later observed that Charles's visits had a measurable positive effect on Maria's condition. Children fighting serious illnesses often become withdrawn and depressed, which can actually impact their physical recovery, Dr. Williams explained. Maria never lost her spark, and I believe Charles's friendship was a big part of that. She always had something to look forward to. Eddie Martinez, meanwhile, found himself in the surreal position of working alongside the man who was quietly saving his daughter's life, while having to pretend he didn't know about Charles's involvement. The hospital had maintained the fiction that Maria's bills were being covered by a combination of insurance adjustments and charitable assistance programs. But Eddie wasn't fooled. The timing was too perfect, and he had noticed Charles asking casual questions about Maria's treatment and progress. More tellingly, Eddie had observed Charles making phone calls during breaks in filming, always moving away from the crew to speak privately. The truth was confirmed one evening when Eddie overheard Charles talking to someone about Maria's latest test results, using medical terminology that demonstrated a detailed knowledge of her condition. Eddie realized that Charles wasn't just visiting his daughter. He was actively monitoring her medical care and ensuring she received the best possible treatment. Eddie struggled with how to handle this knowledge. His pride told him he should confront Charles and try to find some way to repay what was clearly an enormous debt. His practical side told him that accepting this help was the only way to save his daughter's life. His gratitude told him that Charles clearly wanted to keep his involvement private, and respecting that privacy was the least he could do. Eddie chose to honor Charles's desire for anonymity while finding small ways to show his appreciation. He became even more diligent in his work, often staying late to make sure everything was perfect for the next day's filming. He looked for opportunities to make Charles's job easier, anticipating needs and solving problems before they became issues for the production. Charles noticed Eddie's extra efforts but never acknowledged them directly. Instead, he began including Eddie in more technical discussions about lighting and camera angles, treating him as a creative collaborator rather than just a crew member. It was Charles's way of showing respect while maintaining the fiction that their relationship was purely professional. Maria's treatment progressed well throughout the winter of 1974 and into 1975. The experimental therapy that had been financially impossible became routine, and her response to treatment exceeded her doctor's expectations. By spring, she was in remission and able to return to school part-time. Charles's visits continued even after the Death Wish production wrapped. He would quietly appear at the hospital every few weeks, always calling ahead to make sure Maria was feeling well enough for visitors. As she got stronger, their conversations evolved from simply providing comfort during illness to discussing her plans for the future. He talked to her like she was going to grow up and have a normal life, Eddie later told his wife. Even when the doctors weren't sure what would happen, Charles always talked about what Maria wanted to be when she grew up, what schools she might attend, what she wanted to see in the world. He gave her something to fight for beyond just getting better. The success of Maria's treatment created an unexpected problem for Charles. Word had begun to spread within the hospital about the mysterious benefactor who was covering a young patient's expenses, and there was growing curiosity about his identity. Charles realized that maintaining his anonymity would become increasingly difficult as more people became aware of the situation. His solution was characteristically practical. He contacted St. Mary's Children's Hospital Administration and proposed establishing a formal charitable fund that would help other families facing similar financial crises. Charles provided the initial funding for what became the Children's Medical Emergency Fund, which covered treatment costs for families who couldn't afford necessary care. The fund allowed Charles to continue supporting Maria's treatment while creating a legitimate explanation for the financial assistance. As far as official records were concerned, the Martinez family had been selected as one of the fund's first beneficiaries. Charles's personal involvement remained a private matter between him, Maria, and her family. By late 1975, Maria was healthy enough to visit the set of Charles's next film, fulfilling the wish she had expressed during her darkest days in the hospital. Charles arranged for her and her family to watch filming for a day, and he introduced her to the cast and crew as his special consultant on how to make movies more interesting. Maria was fascinated by every aspect of the production, asking endless questions about cameras, lights, and sound equipment. Charles patiently answered each question and made sure she got to see how movie magic was created. For a little girl who had spent months in hospital rooms, the bustling activity of a movie set was the most exciting adventure imaginable. She was like a different child, recalled Assistant Director Tom Patterson, who witnessed Maria's visit. You could see that she had been sick. She was still thin and pale, but her energy and curiosity were infectious. Charles watched her the whole time with this expression of quiet satisfaction, like he was seeing the payoff for something important he had invested in. The Martinez family moved to California in 1976 when Eddie was offered a permanent position with a major studio, a job opportunity that came through Charles's recommendation. The family was able to start fresh in a new place, with Maria's medical needs fully covered and Eddie's career prospects brighter than ever. Charles maintained contact with the family throughout Maria's childhood and adolescence. He attended her high school graduation in 1985, and when she was accepted to UCLA to study medicine, he privately covered her educational expenses. Maria's decision to pursue a career in pediatric oncology was directly inspired by the care she had received during her own illness and her desire to provide the same hope to other sick children. Dr. Maria Martinez graduated from medical school in 1993 and completed her residency at the same hospital where she had been treated as a child. Throughout her medical training, she carried with her the memory of a quiet, tough man who had shown her that strength could be expressed through gentleness, and that true power came from using your advantages to help those who couldn't help themselves. Eddie Martinez worked in the film industry for another 20 years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about Charles's role in saving his daughter's life, honoring the privacy that Charles had always maintained about his charitable activities. But Eddie made sure that everyone he worked with understood that Charles Bronson was more than just a movie star. He was a man who understood that real heroism happened away from cameras and crowds. Charles himself never discussed his relationship with the Martinez family in interviews or public appearances. When asked about his charitable activities, he would deflect questions with characteristic brevity. If you're in a position to help people, you should help people. It's not complicated. The story of Charles Bronson and Maria Martinez represents something essential about the nature of genuine heroism. While Charles was becoming famous worldwide for playing tough guys who solved problems with violence, his real-life heroism was expressed through patience, gentleness, and the quiet application of his resources to solve problems that couldn't be fixed with fists or guns. Maria Martinez Chen, she took her husband's name when she married in 1998, now serves as the head of pediatric oncology at a major children's hospital in Los Angeles. She has never forgotten the lesson she learned as a 7-year-old fighting for her life, that sometimes the difference between hope and despair comes down to whether someone with the power to help is willing to step forward and use that power for good. When Dr. Martinez Chen speaks to medical students about patient care, she often tells them about a movie star who taught her that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about making sure that sick children know they're not alone in their fight. She never mentions Charles Bronson by name, but those who know the story understand that she's sharing the most important lesson of her life. That true strength is measured not by what you can take, but by what you're willing to give. The Children's Medical Emergency Fund that Charles established in 1975 continues to operate today, having helped thousands of families facing medical crises. The fund's mission statement, written by Charles himself, reads simply, "Every child deserves a chance to grow up healthy regardless of their family's ability to pay for treatment." That simple philosophy guided Charles Bronson's approach to heroism throughout his life. While audiences cheered his on-screen vigilante justice, his real legacy was being written in hospital rooms and family homes. One quiet act of kindness at a time. Maria Martinez was just one of many lives he touched, but her story illuminates the man behind the tough guy image. Someone who understood that the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with compassion.